Flight 1282. On Friday, January 5, 2024, Alaska Airlines Flight 1282 set out on what should have been a regular flight from Portland, Oregon to Ontario, California. But only 8 minutes in, it turned into a thrilling tale of an aviation disaster. At a height of approximately 16,000 feet, a critical door stopper protecting an unused emergency escape abruptly dislodged from the aircraft's fuselage. The unexpected event resulted in fast decompression inside the cabin, with passengers immediately hearing a loud noise and experiencing significant fluctuations in air pressure. As oxygen masks were deployed, panic and apprehension spread across the cabin. In response, the pilots declared an emergency and efficiently navigated the plane back to Portland International Airport in minutes. Thanks to the crew's quick measures, what could have been a fatal event turned into a successful emergency landing. While passengers were clearly disturbed, no significant injuries were recorded. However, the consequences of the episode extended far beyond this single trip. The Federal Aviation Administration took decisive action, grounding all Boeing 737 MAX 9 airplanes in the United States. The incident rekindled questions about the safety of the 737 MAX series, which had previously been under scrutiny due to previous scandals. Flight 7. On November 8, 1957, Pan American Flight 7, a majestic Boeing 377 Stratocruiser dubbed Clipper Romance of the Skies, departed San Francisco with 36 passengers destined for Hawaii. The voyage was supposed to be around the world, but the plane mysteriously vanished without a distress call. Pan Am Flight 7 took off from San Francisco near noon with a clear weather update. The 36 passengers settled in for what was expected to be a smooth 10-hour flight to Honolulu. Halfway through the flight, the pilots sent a routine position report to the ground control, as they did every hour. But when they failed to check in the next hour, without any distress signals, air traffic control issued an urgent alert. Flight 7 had disappeared. The day after Pan Am Flight 7 disappeared, a massive search began. Submarines and ships were dispatched to the location where the plane was last reported. A key discovery was not made until November 14th, when a search aircraft discovered wreckage approximately 955 miles northeast of Honolulu. 19 victims were discovered floating in the ocean, and wristwatches on several of them revealed the exact time of the crash, 5:25 p.m., 21 minutes after the pilot's last radio message. The Civil Aeronautics Board investigated the issue, but even after 2 years, they were unable to identify a definite explanation for the incident. The Civil Aeronautics Board closed the Pan Am Flight 7 investigation in 1959, but Ken Fortenberry, a renowned journalist and author, reopened it several years later. They discovered that the majority of the passengers drowned, and the debris revealed signs of fire after the collision. Pan Am and the FBI suspected that disgruntled employee Eugene Crosswaite, a flight purser with a difficult past, may have sabotaged the flight. Another explanation pointed to technical deficiencies in the Boeing 377's 7-foot propellers, which were prone to imbalances and oil transfer problems. The FAA issued a warning about these concerns in early 1957, and Pan Am's plane was required to have its engines repaired. Some people assumed that mechanical faults caused the crash, but to this day, the exact reason for the ditch is unknown. Flight 610. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 took off from Jakarta, Indonesia, with 181 passengers for a short domestic flight to Bangala Island. When the plane lifted off the runway from Jakarta, the pilot immediately sensed that something was wrong. The captain's control yoke started shaking, a warning that the plane was about to stall. The pilots were confused as to what the problem was. The pilots had no choice except to continue ascending. Meanwhile, the air traffic controller was ignorant of the developing danger in the cockpit. A warning light flashed. The airspeed indicators were giving inconsistent readings. Nonetheless, the air traffic controller on the ground radioed them to climb to 27,000 feet, unaware of the risk. The first officer noticed something strange. The altimeter was not adding up. The aircraft's speed and altitude on screen differed significantly from the marking they were supposed to be flying at. At that point, the pilots knew that things were out of control. Flying 5,000 feet above the sea, Captain Sunisia continued to keep the plane's nose up. The flight became increasingly erratic and difficult to control over the Java Sea. Unaware of the situation, the controller cleared the plane to fly at any altitude above the sea, but Flight 610 nosedived toward the sea, leaving the pilots in a dilemma. Unfortunately, they couldn't pull the plane up. 12 minutes after takeoff, the plane crashed into the Java Sea. 30 minutes after the crash, the wreckage of Lion Air Flight 610 was located. None of the 181 passengers survived the crash. The flight report showed the plane's altitude over time. The plane was in full thrust during takeoff, but at a certain point, the nose kept lurching downward. The pilots continued to fight with the MCAS, Boeing stabilization software, in case the system fed erroneous data to the control tower. But during all this time, the plane struggled to gain altitude and, unfortunately, crashed. Flight 1036. Aeroflot Flight 1036 took off from Sochi on a calm, clear evening on October 1, 1972, bound for Moscow. On board were 100 passengers, including 8 crew members. The skies were clear, the air temperature a pleasant 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and visibility stretched over 3 miles. It seemed like a routine flight, nothing out of the ordinary. The Ilyushin IL-18 lifted off from Sochi Airport, the engines humming smoothly as it began its ascent. Just a minute later, the flight crew contacted air traffic control, confirming a right turn with a climb of nearly 10,000 feet as instructed. Everything was going according to plan, but that was the last moment of normalcy. In an instant, things took a deadly turn. At just 500 to 800 feet above the ground, as the aircraft was beginning its turn, the plane suddenly veered sharply left, completely against the commands given. It pitched into a steep nosedive, plunging toward the Black Sea. The plane suddenly vanished from the screen's air traffic controllers. Nearly 20 minutes later, a chilling message came through. Ships in the area had seen the unthinkable. A plane had crashed into the sea. The aircraft had veered off course, just 6.5 miles from the shoreline, and then disappeared beneath the waves. Witnesses could only watch helplessly as it plummeted into the water. Hours later, search and rescue teams discovered floating wreckage and the tragic debris of human life. All 109 souls aboard were gone, leaving behind only fragments of the mystery that followed. The crash site, nearly 2,000 feet below the surface of the Black Sea and buried in mud, offered few clues. The depth of the wreckage hindered the investigation, and the last messages could not be discovered since the black boxes were never found. Many theories pointed toward the aircraft crash. Based on the lack of evidence retrieved, no evidence regarding a bomb explosion or sabotage could ever be found. But the investigators were convinced that the flight met its untimely demise because of a bird strike caused by migrating birds during that time of the season. Still, concrete proof about the crash of Aeroflot Flight 1036 remains unknown. Flight 111. On September 2, 1998, Swissair Flight 111 tragically crashed into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada, claiming the lives of all 229 people on board. The flight was en route from New York City to Geneva. The McDonnell Douglas MD-11 departed John F. Kennedy International Airport with 14 crew members and 215 passengers aboard. Less than an hour in the air, however, the flight crew sensed a strange burning smell in the cockpit, followed by some smoke that emerged before disappearing. The pilots initially suspected an air conditioning malfunction and issued a pan-pan distress signal, which indicated a problem but not an urgent threat. However, unknown to the crew, a fire caused by faulty wiring had already started in the aircraft's extremely flammable insulation. After speaking with air traffic authorities, the pilots turned toward Halifax, which was approximately 56 miles away. To avoid flaring up of fire, the crew began dumping fuel in preparation for landing, but 3 minutes later, crucial systems failed and smoke entered the cockpit. 10 minutes later, the plane lost communication with air traffic control and crashed into the ocean, breaking up on impact approximately 5 miles from Peggy's Cove. Rescue attempts began immediately, but unfortunately, no survivors could be found. Salvage operations recovered 98% of the aircraft, including the flight recorders, which had stopped recording 6 minutes before the crash owing to an electrical failure. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada's investigation determined in 2003 that improper wiring in the newly installed entertainment system caused the fire, which was compounded by flammable insulation. Flight 210. Bellview Airlines Flight 210 was a routine domestic flight in Nigeria, scheduled to fly from Lagos to Abuja on October 22, 2005. The Boeing 737, with experienced pilots Captain Emasuin Lambert and First Officer Ashun Ernest at the controls, departed from Lagos Murtala Muhammad International Airport. But not long after takeoff, something went horribly wrong. That night, the weather was ominous, with thunderstorms gathering near Lagos, especially northeast of Murtala Muhammad Airport, though visibility was over 6 miles, and lightning could be seen in the skies ahead. The pilots, sensing the looming danger, told air traffic control they'd need to turn right after takeoff to avoid the storms. After the final radio contact with Lagos approach control, all communication was lost. A search and rescue operation was initiated, and hours later, authorities discovered the wreckage near Lisa village 27 miles from Lagos. The sight was horrific. The 737 had crashed into the earth, leaving a huge crater with tiny pieces of wreckage and human bones spread across a nearby plantation. Almost nothing remained of the jet or its passengers. Authorities secured the area, but looters had already scavenged it for scrap metal. Confusion continued as officials mistakenly reported that the black boxes had been retrieved. Despite assistance from the U.S. investigators, the black boxes were never discovered, and radar data was unavailable due to maintenance. With no survivors, black box, or radar, the mystery intensified. Following the disaster of Bellview Airlines Flight 210, the inquiry was hampered by the destruction of critical evidence, including the black boxes. Several circumstances pointed to a calamity waiting to happen: a plane with unsolved mechanical concerns, fatigued pilots with questionable training, and a turbulent night trip. The airline had pushed its pilots beyond their safety restrictions, and the aircraft was judged unsafe for flight. Flight 182, Sriwijaya Air Flight 182, a Boeing 737-524, carried 62 passengers on a routine domestic flight from Jakarta to Pontianak, Indonesia, on January 9, 2021. Among them were 50 passengers and 6 operating crew members, including Captain Afwan, a former Indonesian Air Force pilot. There were also 6 non-operating crew members on board. The aircraft was built in 1994 and had been in service with Sriwijaya Air since 2012, replacing older 737-200 models. The airplane took off from the runway and was scheduled to land in Pontianak. Following the takeoff, the plane was cleared to rise to 13,000 feet and quickly changed to a heading of 045 degrees as it resumed its ascent. However, tragedy struck just 7 miles from the airport. The aircraft began to lose altitude alarmingly. Eyewitnesses described witnessing the plane explode in midair, with blazing wreckage falling into the sea, including what seemed to be shards of plywood. Within moments, the aircraft had crashed into the waters off the coast, leaving a trail of destruction. Rescue efforts were promptly launched, but unfortunately, all 62 lives were lost. Indonesian authorities said the Sriwijaya Air Boeing 737 tragedy, which killed 62 passengers, was caused by a defective throttle system and a delayed pilot response. The catastrophe sparked concerns about the aircraft's safety, maintenance, and pilot training during times of crisis, casting an overarching shadow over the aviation industry as investigators worked to determine the cause of the sudden drop and explosion. Flight 804. In the early hours of May 19, 2016, EgyptAir Flight 804 was nearing the Egyptian coast from Paris, carrying 66 people on board, met a fateful calamity. The flight was almost 180 miles off the coast when it suddenly vanished. The Airbus A320 crashed into the Mediterranean Sea, leaving no survivors. Minutes before the catastrophe, the aircraft's ACARS system issued alerts indicating a malfunction. Debris was located 180 miles off the shore, with the disaster at a depth of over 10,000 feet. Although the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were retrieved, the reason for the crash is unknown. Initial suspicions pointed to terrorism. However, ACARS communications revealed something different: a fire on board. The radar showed the plane taking an unusual path, suddenly turning left and then completing a full 360-degree circle as it plummeted. Experts believe the crew attempted to vent the smoke from a fire rather than dealing with a bomb threat. French investigators ultimately decided that the most likely cause was a fire that ignited in the cockpit. A 2022 report extended on this notion, but no definitive answers were supplied. Flight 850. On July 10, 2002, Swiss International Flight 850 was scheduled to fly from Basel, Switzerland to Hamburg, Germany on an Embraer 145. However, technical concerns necessitated a last-minute transfer to a Saab 2000, which delayed the flight. Further delays occurred when the crew discussed the weather forecast nearing Hamburg. The flight finally departed with 16 passengers and 4 crew members on board. Turbulence confronted the pilots shortly after takeoff, prompting them to request air traffic control direction in the face of severe rainfall. Flight 850 entered Hamburg. However, the pilots had to perform a go-around due to heavy turbulence caused by a storm. With 45 minutes of fuel remaining, They investigated diversion alternatives but quickly realized that surrounding airports were also affected by turbulent weather. The crew diverted to Berlin's Tegel Airport, where aircraft control room reported clear skies. Severe turbulence on the approach necessitated yet another diversion. Running low on fuel, the pilots headed toward Verneuchen Airfield, which was 20 miles away. The aircraft attempted a hazardous landing. Despite being warned to land beyond the embankment, the Saab 2000 touched down too early, causing all landing gear to shear off. The plane skidded a quarter of a mile down the runway before the engines caught fire, which the crew promptly extinguished. Fortunately, none of the 20 on board were wounded. The study, which took more than 8 years to complete, blamed the tragedy on weak meteorological data, incorrect ATIS information, and inadequate runway markings.